the other day you awarded some of the heroes of Russia, and you said that the guys should be spared, but we should continue pressing. For 2 years we have been living amidst the special military operation, so we receive a spate of questions from everybody on that. What is your take on these 2 years? What is the current pace? What the goals may be? Are they the same or have they changed? And when we will arrive at peace? The peace will come when we reach our goals that you have mentioned. And coming back to the goals, they remain unchanged. I will remind you, it means denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine and its neutral status. Let's have a look from the perspective of denazification. During the negotiations that followed after the preparation of a draft of possible agreement back then, that was mentioned by the Kiev authorities the other day. Well, on the whole, they did not agree. They needed some denazification, saying that there was no Nazism growth in that country. Well, how come their national hero is a well-known Nazi figure, Bandera, who has been proclaimed a national hero? How come that? Yes, they do have it. And when today's head of presidential office in Kiev, before the whole world gives a round of applause to a former SS soldier that participated in Holocaust, which was the extermination of 1.5 million of Jews, Poles and Russians, and he gave him a standing ovation. Is it not a manifestation of Nazism? So denazification is a relevant thing. During those talks, we were told that, well, actually they would not rule out enacting some legal acts. That was during that series of talks in Istanbul. Now, with respect to demilitarizing Ukraine, unless they want to come to terms peacefully, we have to take some action, including military action. But today, Ukraine virtually produces or manufactures nothing. They have been trying to maintain their manufacturing capability, but, actually they have been importing things for free, freeloading. But, it will come to an end sooner or later. Well, they will keep receiving some aid, but, the annihilation continues. With respect to aircraft and air defense systems, they received like 420 or 30 tanks, as had been promised. Everything had been delivered. All the things that the Westerners had promised were supplied, but all of that was annihilated. 747 tanks were destroyed as of last night. Since the start of the counter-offensive, around 2,300 armored personnel vehicles of different types. So this is demilitarizing. Either we come to terms on the specific military parameters, and we did agree upon these parameters that were put into the litter bin later. And so we have other opportunities, either to come to terms or to have our way compellingly.
We have a question on the international agenda. The question is threefold. First, do you see any prospects in normalizing relations with the European Union? Recently, it's been becoming apparent that the West is growing tired of supporting Ukraine. What do you think about that? Another question. The right politicians are getting stronger on the European political scene. How could you comment on that? Are you concerned about that? Thank you. Speaking of normalizing the relations, it's not only up to us. We did not ruin the relations. They did that. They've always been trying to push us back to the backstage and the background, disregarding our interests. The conflict that took place in Ukraine, how did it begin? Let us remember. Let us take 3 or 4 minutes. It all began with a coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014. Before that, we've been trying our best. For decades, we've been trying to build normal relations with Ukraine, even following essentially a coup d'etat when Viktor Yanukovych wasn't allowed to come to power when he won the elections. They declared a third tour of the elections, the third round, even though this went against the constitution. This was something like a creeping coup d'etat, but we accepted that. So what happened next? He won the elections, the next one. So what did our so-called opponents do? They committed a coup d'etat. You see, here is the problem. Despite the tragedy of these events, we've always been saying that the Russians and the Ukrainians are one people, essentially, and what we're witnessing now is a great tragedy resembling a civil war between the brothers, when brothers are on opposing sides. And it's not even their fault. The entire southeast of Ukraine has always been pro-Russian. Historically, these were Russian territories. My colleague is raising the poster saying Turkey. He knows that the entire Turkish and the Black Sea region knows that the entire Black Sea shore went to Russia following the Russian-Turkish wars. This has nothing to do with Ukraine. Odessa is a Russian city. Crimea is Russian. Everyone knows that perfectly well. But they started making up historical nonsense, saying that back in the day Vladimir Lenin gave those territories to Ukraine when the Soviet Union was established. We accepted that even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We accepted that and we were ready to live with that. But the southeast, the pro-Russian part, was always important to us. During the elections, they've always been voting for those who promoted the pro-Russian policies both inside and outside of Ukraine. And this was perfectly fine for Russia. But following the coup d'etat in 2014, it was perfectly clear that they wouldn't allow us to build normal relations with Ukraine. The coup d'etat that the Americans spent $5 billion on, they stated this openly. In 2014, 3 foreign ministers came from Europe. The Polish minister, the German and the French. And so they signed up as guarantors of the agreements between the authorities, President Yanukovych, and the opposition. They said that everything would be resolved peacefully. But 2 days later, they committed a coup d'etat. Why? They could have gone to the elections. But no, they had to create a conflict. Who did that? It was our American so-called friends. The Europeans who had signed up as guarantors of the agreements between the authorities and the opposition pretended to know nothing. Now ask anyone in Europe, can anyone remember that? Of course they don't, but we do, and we will not forget it. In their aspiration to creep up to our borders and take Ukraine into NATO, they have led us into a tragedy. Remember the violent events in Donbass. Throughout 8 years, all of this resulted in the current tragedy. They forced our hand. And so, when I talk about the United States, they organized that, and Europe is only playing into their hands. How can we build a relation with them? We are ready for that, but the Europeans pretend to know and remember nothing. They made only 2 or 3 references to the Minsk agreements they had signed, although they had no intention of complying with them. That was a pretend signature. The guarantees between the authorities and the opposition in Ukraine in 2014 were supposedly signed by them too, and immediately disregarded. Here is what I'm talking about. They have mostly lost their sovereignty. Many of their decisions are harming themselves, but still they do that. Many European public figures on the surface are acting like General de Gaulle, who was fighting for the interests of France with weapons. He assembled all the French people to show resistance to the occupying forces. However, in practice, they're acting like Marshal Pétain. Even though he was a hero of World War I, in World War II he was a Nazi collaborationist. He accepted the will of the occupying forces. Almost everyone's acting like that. A few people can be an exception. For example, we see some examples like Viktor Orban in Hungary and some other people. They are not pro-Russian politicians. They are pro-national politicians protecting their own national interests. There are no people like that anymore. I am not sure about the explanation. They are too reliant on their big brother, the United States. Still, we're ready to build relations with them. Speaking of the United States, we're ready to talk to them too. We believe that the United States is an important and necessary country for the world. However, their absolutely imperial policy is hurting themselves. It's not even hurting us, it's hurting them first and foremost, because in the public eye they have to act as an empire. And when they're trying to compromise on something, their voters see this as a failure. That's why the elites are forced to act in this way. As soon as something changes domestically, this would establish the fundamental conditions that would allow them to respect others, to respect other countries, to seek compromise rather than use the force and sanctions. Only then will we see the fundamental conditions to establish full-fledged relations with them. So far, we see none. But we are ready.